We are here for a very interesting session on getting published. Let me first introduce Bhavani Shankar, who's currently, Bhavani, do you want to just give a little wave to the audience? He's currently at the Center for Development, Environment and Policy. He's Professor of International Food, Agriculture and Health out there. He's at the School of Oriental and African Studies, popularly known as SOAS. He's also an applied economist working on research areas at the intersection of agriculture, food, nutrition, and health in developing as well as developed countries. His current research interests include analysis of economic drivers of over- and undernutrition, food and nutrition policy evaluation, and the role of agriculture and food systems in enabling better nutrition and health. Bhavani's ongoing research projects include LANSA, the Leveraging Agriculture and Nutrition in South Asia, and POSH, Palm Oil, Sustainability, Health and Economics. He's currently an academic editor of PLOS One, and he also served as a managing editor of Food Policy during from 2011 to 2015. Wonderful to have you here, Bhavani. May I come to Jerry? Gerald Shively is at the Purdue University. He's professor and associate head of the Department of Agricultural Economics and directs the MS and PhD programs out there. He has more than 20 years of research experience in agricultural development, food security, natural resource management, and he has published more than 100 scholarly works. He's the recipient of numerous teaching and research awards, including the 2007 Purdue College of Agriculture Outstanding Researcher Award. He is a Purdue University faculty scholar, and he received his PhD in Agriculture and Applied Economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1996. He is the editor of Agricultural Economics. Former. Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. Now may I introduce Prakash Shetty. Prakash is the CEO of LANSA. He's Professor of Public Health, Nutrition at the University of Southampton. He was Southampton Medical School in the UK. He was the Honorary Research Professor at Oxford Brookes University in the UK, Emeritus Professor of Physiology and Nutrition at St. George's Medical College, Bangalore, and he served as the Chief of Nutrition Planning, Assessment and Evaluation in the Food and Nutrition Division of Food and Agricultural Organization at Rome between 2001 and 2005, and he has been a consultant to the UN and other international organizations. Earlier, he was the editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition for 6 years, and the deputy editor of the British Journal of Nutrition. It's wonderful to have you here, Prakash. Now I bring you to my colleague at the Institute of Medicine, Professor Dr. Archana Amatya. Archana is the editor of the Journal of Nepal Health Research Council, the editor of Nepal Journal of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. She started off as an obstetrician, and I'm so pleased she's moved to public health. And currently we work in the same department at Institute of Medicine, and she's been working to co-host this symposium as well for the last so many years. She's also the editor of Journal of Institute of Medicine. We have, may I invite Richard, please? Richard Strange. Richard is the Chief of Food Security Journal. He's the honorary professor at the University College London and honorary research fellow at the Birkbeck College, University of London. Do you mind coming on the stage? You're comfortable? If you would come join us on the dais, that would be lovely. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen and lady, for your presence this morning. This is a very interesting session, as I just mentioned, and I look forwards to hearing from the diverse panelists that we have here who represent nutrition, agriculture, economics, health. I have no doubt each one of them will bring their perspective and make it a very enriching experience as they delve into the similarities, the differences, and the importance of publishing, what to do, where to publish, how to identify. Those are the areas that we would be discussing during this panel. May I now request, perhaps, Jerry, would you like to start? What we intend to do is we would like to invite all the panelists to speak for a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, and thereafter we would take questions from the audience, which the panelists would respond, and we'll see how things go from there. So may I invite Professor Gerald Shively to start?
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for that very generous introduction. So I think that my comments this morning will reflect both my experience as a young researcher and 20 years of working and struggling myself to publish my research in respected journals, as well as my evolution from being only a researcher, I say only a researcher, to being somewhat of a gatekeeper for the community, because in my 9 years as editor of the journal Agricultural Economics, and in my capacity as a member of the editorial board of several other journals, I've often seen that role as a kind of gatekeeper for the discipline, allowing some research to move forward into publication and into the marketplace of ideas. And I think that the important thing for young researchers to think about is the community to which you belong, the audience to which you want to communicate, and to think about your role as providing ideas for the marketplace of ideas, and to strengthen your ideas through peer review, and ultimately to have those ideas published so that they can be shared as we move forward in an incremental process of expanding sort of the boundaries of knowledge. So I know we'll be spending a lot of time this morning talking about specific strategies for publication, but I think that another message that I'd like to deliver is that as you begin to think about yourself and your own research career, think of yourself as a member of a much larger community. Think about your role as developing a research program and a research portfolio that communicates with a set of other researchers, and to think of your role as not just publishing papers, but as contributing ideas and research to a community. And I think that will be a longer-term strategy for success in publication.
Could you also tell us a little bit about what kind of attributes, behavioral attributes, do young researchers need to develop from the very beginning in order to achieve those goals that you just outlined?
Sure, I guess there are several. One is if you look at productive young researchers, there are probably two characteristics of those individuals that are fairly uniform. One is that they have multiple strands of research in development at all times. So when I was a young researcher, I was encouraged to have 5 papers in review at any given time, right? So that means developing a pipeline of research and to think about always moving your research forward. And as we'll talk about later, the timeline for publication is often a very long one. And so you need to be working on multiple things at the same time to have a pipeline of research that you're moving into publication. Some of those papers will be successful initially, some of them may not, some of them may be things that you'll have to continue to work on for months or maybe years before they're ultimately published. But having several strands of research simultaneously, I think, is a recipe for long-term success. The other thing is that oftentimes we're very protective of our ideas. We have an idea for research, we have something that we're working on, and we want to guard and protect that from others, often because research ideas are hard to come up with. And that's a mistake, because often the most important thing is to make sure that your ideas are exposed to peers and to other researchers, and that you have an opportunity to get feedback on that, and to the sunlight of showing your work in public is a good antiseptic for removing bad ideas and buttressing good ones. And so another characteristic of successful researchers is that they're often presenting their work publicly and getting feedback on that and sharing their papers with colleagues so that they can get feedback to improve that work. So I think those two things. One, have multiple strands of research that you're working on simultaneously, and then also to make sure that you're exposing your ideas to peers so that those ideas are strengthened. Because at the end of the day, publication is really about ideas and stories, right? And having good stories that resonate with the academic community or the research community that you're trying to communicate with.
Thank you. May I now fly our audience across Atlantic and perhaps request Professor Prakash Shetty to shed his light and share his thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. If I may follow on what Jerry was discussing, one of the significant things that I found having examined students for PhD, both in guided and examined students both in Britain and in Europe, I find the European model more amenable to prepare students to publish papers. Many of the students that I have examined in the Netherlands or in Scandinavian countries, they are based more on publications rather than a thesis itself. The thesis consists of 5 or 6 good papers that are published in very good journals, peer-reviewed journals, or accepted in peer-reviewed journals. And that actually inculcates the discipline to write papers, to review the literature properly, and to actually address what the journal requires so that they can get the paper into publication. I think what I have found a lot of difficulty with my British students in the UK, guiding them through a PhD, encouraging them to write papers. And I have students I've lost who've done 5 years' work, published got their PhDs, and have not published a single paper. And I think when you have a system of a PhD that does not have publication as the mode of presenting the thesis, then I think one way we could encourage them is to ensure that every one of the chapters in their book actually will ultimately produce a paper, so that they prepare while they are writing their thesis as though this is a paper I'm going to publish at the end, this is the journal I'd like to submit it to, so that they at least get into trying to prepare to enter this world where you either publish or you perish.
Thank you. I'm just intrigued because all of us who are in the academic struggle with our students publishing their paper. You mentioned that, you compared the British with the European model and said that, perhaps European model having the system to the necessity to publish as part of the PhD was encouraging students to publish more and get more clued into the business of publishing. Are there any other factors, you reckon, which bring that, which make that into a normal process, of a PhD program?
I think the environment in which the student does his PhD is very important. If there are several members in that faculty or in that group that are publishing actively, then that provides an environment for others to feel that they should also participate in this process and have some reflected glory from getting a paper that they see their peers receiving. So I think that environment is very important. And again, I have to confess that my experience is really with biological and qualitative work, quantitative work.
Quantitative.
And so I have very little experience with qualitative work. And one of the things about publishing in quantitative research is that the turnover is very rapid. I mean, my own experience as editor of the European Journal, when I took over the European Journal in 2006, we had about 400 submissions a year, and we would review about 98% of the papers. And that took a lot of time. And we then finally, by the time I left, we were receiving 900 and odd papers a year, but we were only reviewing less than 40% of the papers. And the rest of them would get an answer within a week that their paper was not going to be processed any further. And this way we shortened the time we took so that the researcher could take their own time and submit it elsewhere or rewrite it. And the other advantage was that since we were reviewing a smaller number of papers, we could complete the process within 3 months. You could give them a decision. And I noticed that you had some data on how long it takes to give a decision, which is also important.
Yeah.
If you want to have publications as a means of enhancing your thesis, like in the European model, then you want a quick decision, because if it takes 2 years, then your PhD is prolonged that much longer. So that becomes very important.
May I request you to pause here? In our audience, there's a range of students as well. And my question to you is, how could one enhance their chances of their paper being thoroughly reviewed? You said that, when you started, you were reviewing 98% of the papers. Now, though you're receiving more papers, but you are reviewing less. Perhaps, they get desk rejected or whatever the process is, whatever your experience is. Would you like to share with our audience, how do they increase their chances for the paper to be reviewed? What steps could they take?
I think the paper has to be relevant to that journal. This is very important. And when I say relevant, as an editor, I'm sitting there and looking at papers, particularly from developing countries, where they are just applying a methodology and trying to do it on their particular population. And the science, the quality of the science is good, but from an editor's point of view, it's not relevant. And we would turn around and say, listen, this is more something that you should publish in a national journal or in a regional journal. It has no place in it. We wouldn't waste our time and pages publishing this. That's an important. So the relevance becomes
regional interest and relevance could be one.
Important.
Anything else?
The quality of the paper clearly decides. One look at a paper, we know where it would be within the average for our journal. And sometimes we make mistakes, but we do. And I think if you think your paper, something that people should remember who submit manuscripts to journals is that they shouldn't just take the editor's word for it. If they think that their paper deserves a second shot, they should write back to the editor and say, listen, I don't agree with you, and I would like you to have a look at my paper. So, otherwise it's the quality that determines whether we proceed with it or not.
Thank you. Dr. Archana.
The biggest problem we have at the moment is in choosing the right journal, because I know students would come up and bring a whole list of journals and ask me, which one do you think this would be the appropriate one? And as Prakash was saying, I always tell them, why don't you publish them in a national journal? Because when we are publishing our research, our manuscript is basically not only for publication, it's also, you want to make sure that you catch the right audience. No. And initially, students, whether it be PhD students or masters or anyone to that accord, would think, why do you want me to publish it in a very low impact journal, probably a national one or one in an institute. But I don't believe that, because I believe that directly or indirectly, for the career advancement, for professional reputation, and even funding opportunities, the article which has the manuscript which has been published is going to take you a long, long way. And I'm telling this out of experience, because I remember when I published my first article on abortion, I aimed for a very high impact journal, because I thought that was the right one and it's going to take me a long way. But then eventually my supervisor told me to get it in a national journal, and I tell you, it's really helped me a long way after that. So it's very important to decide who do you want to show your work to, and that really helps in the long way. And besides that, another thing which I think is very important is, like for example, for the Journal of the Nepal Health Research Council, it's a multidisciplinary journal. It's easy for us as editors to accept various ones. But when I work at the Journal of the Obstetrics and Gynecology, then it becomes a totally different, because it's a very specialized journal and we want to take something which would cater to the OBGYN community. So as Jerry was saying, the relevance of why and where you want to showcase your work seems to be the crux of publishing.
Could you share your journey? I mean, how did that revelation come about? Was it after many rejections? What was it that...
I aimed for a very high impact journal, as I said. Then I sent it, and the editor wrote back to me that, this is not the right journal for you. And I think that was that time I thought it was like, what is he trying to tell me? Discouraged me. But then today when I sit back and review all the articles, I think that was the best point of it. It really opened my eyes, and then I knew the relevancy of showcasing my work to an audience who would absorb it.
May I request now Bhavani Shankar to share his thoughts?
Sure, thank you. I've just written down some notes, so I'm not checking my email. I just wrote down a few notes about from my perspective, if you have a paper that you believe in that you think is good, a few very basic steps to improve the chances of getting published. First of all, and this repeats what others have said before, is to do your research on the journal. This is absolutely critical, because otherwise you're wasting time. You're sending it to the wrong journal, you're getting knocked back, your confidence is coming down, and then quite often the paper just falls through and it doesn't go anywhere. So do your research in advance of publishing it. So to give you an example, I've been involved in the editorial duties for 2 journals. Food policy, which is it's got a very explicit policy focus. It's specifically to do with food. It's got it's got a good blend of rigor and relevance. If you want it to be widely read, then food policy is a decent journal within the agricultural economics policy sciences discipline, because it is quite widely read. So these are some of the things that characterize food policy. But I've also been associated as one of many academic editors for PLOS ONE, which is a multidisciplinary journal in the sense that it publishes everything from aeronautics to agriculture to nutrition and everything else. So it's a multi-purpose journal. And in PLOS ONE, explicitly, innovation is not a factor. So editors are told you cannot reject on the basis of lack of innovation, because the belief there is that if something is rigorously done, then it's publishable. So there's a big difference. So if your main selling point is innovation, you think that is a big factor in your paper, then certainly you can go for something other than PLOS ONE. But on the other hand, if you think it's nicely done, rigorously done, but it's not necessarily trying to push the boundaries of science in a certain direction, then you might consider something called PLOS. But remember that in PLOS, the rigor will be important because that is an important characteristic. So do your research. So if you go, for example, to the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, then the rigor and the innovation are both absolutely important. It's not necessarily the objective to be widely read in the AJAE. In fact, very few people probably read it beyond the authors and a small circle of people beyond it. But you have to do your research in determining which journal you want to publish in. And that will save you a lot of heartache, that will save you a lot of time. The second thing I would say is invest in writing. It has a disproportionate impact on your chances of acceptance. And quite often people do great analysis, they do great work, good research, they underinvest in the writing of it. Good researchers do not necessarily make good writers. The correlation is far from perfect. So really, if you've got an authoring team, and if you can identify a person within your authoring team who is the best writer, if you can get that person to actually to take the onus of the writing and make it properly written, then that would improve your chances. Now these days, just like Prakash mentioned, for example, in food policy, when I started as editor in 2011, we were getting about 350 papers a year, something like that. By the time I finished in 2015, we were getting 700 plus, and partly that's because the impact factor went up, and so the number of submissions follows the impact factors. So increasingly, we were just desk rejecting a large percentage, certainly in excess of 50%, and now probably even a higher percentage gets desk rejected. So in desk rejecting, the editor is probably going to take not more than 15 minutes in deciding whether this is going to be desk rejected or not, because pretty soon you can tell whether something has a good chance of making it or not. So you have to invest in the writing in such a way that you convince that person, right from your abstract to the first few pages of your paper, communicate your contribution, what is innovative, what is good about this paper, what new vistas does it open up, and you have to communicate that quickly so that a judgment can be made and you pass that first hurdle. So that is one thing. So you always get to the point quickly, have a tight introduction. Have messages that you reinforce from the start, in the middle, all the way through. Decide what message you're trying to convey. It's a communication exercise, so you reinforce your message, and that is commonly known in communication psychology. When you get past that hurdle and it gets reviewed and you get referee comments back, show good faith. Take every referee comment seriously. Do not brush aside things that you think. Don't say, oh, the referee doesn't understand this. That's probably because you haven't communicated it well enough. So take everything in good faith, address everything, and then the editors often, there is, if I can see that somebody's tried quite hard, there are always points for effort. On the other hand, if somebody's done a decent paper but just not bothered very much to address referee comments, that can have a negative influence on the paper being accepted. Also, be candid about your shortcomings. So very often people, dress up their paper and say it's doing all these fantastic things. But as the reviewer is reading it, they know they can spot the shortcomings. And if they feel you're trying to hide your shortcomings or you're trying to be over-optimistic about the positive points, then that creates a negative perception. So accept your shortcomings, discuss them, say what could be done about it in the future. Maybe I don't have enough data in this case, but maybe future studies can pick it up. So that's always a useful thing to do. So basically, and then the final thing is persist. Don't get downhearted if you get rejected. I know some cases where I had a colleague at the University of Reading where I worked before, whose maxim always was, if you get rejected, go to the next higher journal on the list, not the lower, because that's what usually people will do. He always went to the next, the one that was higher than that one in that list. And it worked fantastically for him. And so if you've got a bit of luxury of time, this is probably not the case for early case researchers. If you've got the luxury of time, persist and don't lower your sights excessively if you think you've got a good product. But again, if you don't think it's the level of the international top quality journal, then again, don't waste your time. But if you believe in it, persist. So those are the things I would say.
Thank you so much. For many of the audience, English may be the second or the third language. And you've already emphasized the importance of the writing skills. Would you like to talk share perhaps some more insight into how people from this part of the world could bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's always a difficult one. But I would say the quality of English, certainly for editors of international journals, editors as well as reviewers tend to be sympathetic about the quality of the English, but they will be less sympathetic about the quality of the writing. And there is a distinction between the two. So you can have, not perfect English, But if you invested in the writing and you've sequenced things and you're communicating a message, reinforcing messages, and so even if your English is less than perfect, I think most people will tend to buy it. So, so it is important to have a certain minimum standard of English in writing for these journals, but it's not the deal breaker. But certainly the quality of the writing, i.e., how you phrase things and how you break up the argument into different bits, that's what I would pay the most attention to. With regard to the English, if you've got a colleague who can check it for you, if you've got somebody who is a native speaker or who is got huge experience in writing in English in journals and so on, send it to them. You can buy them dinner later. Ask them to do you a favor and just sort of go through the basic typographic errors or grammatical errors you might have made, just fix it. But the quality of the writing will be up to you. Somebody can fix the English at a later stage.
It's a great honor that Professor Richard Strange is here. I would perhaps like to hold your thoughts till we've taken some questions. But if there are some burning issues that you would like to flag at the outset, you're most welcome.
Well, perhaps I should speak later. I'd like to congratulate my fellow people on this panel for giving such illuminating talks. So perhaps I do have some slides I could show, but
perhaps later.
Yep.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you, panelists. May I now open the floor for questions?
We live in an age where, instant news and people want to know what's happening. The human side of science and all that. I'm working really at the grassroots level. And there's so much pressure to share what you are seeing instantly in the field. We have blogs, we have all these other, social media, instant stuff. I know this is kind of like a distraction in terms of a question given what you have covered so far. But the question is, how does this impact on the more serious publications, which is really the subject we are discussing now? Given, the interest, the human sort of interest, there are people that want to know, they want to connect, for instance, with the communities you're working with, which obviously is not the audience you're talking about here.
Once your paper is rejected from a journal, will it be wise to rewrite it and resubmit, or following Bhavani Shankar, heading to the high impact one? And the brief one is, does it matter with the time span of your research and the time span of getting published? Because you go every here and there for trying publication and you get rejected and you keep trying. And does it matter with the time span when your research was done and when your work is published?
My question is relevant to the issue of sharing your ideas to allow you to improve your ideas for publication. But then there's also the issue related to social media, but also things like conferences and the other, where sharing your information at a conference or at other in some journals might actually limit your ability to publish that work because it's considered to be in the public domain. So how do we strike the balance? How do we share in such a way that you can still enter the journals and not limit your ability to publish because of the way in which you have shared the information prior to that?
Based on the journals you have come across, my curiosity or question is, can we digitize value chain ecology or nutrition in the form of logic to execute in artificial intelligence? Or in other words, can we relate data of this ecology of physical human being or plants or environment into a robot or logic it uses for its programming? Thank you.
Would you like to pose it to any particular panelist?
Any panelist, I would be thankful.
Thank you. Since none of the questions came for any particular person among the panel, may I just request to respond? Would you be interested?
Sure. Maybe I'll try to respond to the first two. So I believe that researchers have an obligation to communicate outside academia. Many times, as researchers, we think that the sort of final product is the academic journal article that's published in the journal, and that once we've communicated to our peers in the peer-reviewed literature that our job is done, I think that we often have an obligation to communicate outside the academy. And so your point is very well taken, that we have an obligation, and we also have the opportunity to use social media and other outlets to try to distill into a more common kind of language our key research results, and to communicate those to a larger audience. So I think the point that you're trying to make is an important one, and one that researchers should be quite cognizant of. And others may have reactions to that as well, including practical approaches to that. So the second question was about what to do when your paper is rejected. And I think the issue really is looking at why it was rejected, and your response needs to, as was mentioned earlier, take sincere comments into consideration. So if there are reviewer comments that point out problems in the paper, I think it's often a poor strategy to resubmit a paper without dealing with those problems. Oftentimes you'll find that the second round of review at a new journal will tap the same researchers who looked at the paper the first time, especially if you're communicating in a very small community. And undoubtedly, if one reviewer has found a flaw, a subsequent reviewer will probably find the same flaw. So I think if there's sincere comments that come from reviewers that point to specific issues, then you're obligated to respond to those before you resubmit your paper elsewhere. On the other hand, if the comments are from the editor in terms of goodness of fit with the journal, then I think often the strategy would be to send it to a journal that's more appropriate and maybe in its current form.
Just to add on to what Jerry said regarding the rejection and the issue about timelines, because I agree with you that, once it gets rejected, which took quite a long time for you to get the answer, and then you think about where next to go, and by that time your data could have been old. So what I think is, once it gets rejected, it's very important that you understand and the journal policies and find out how many times did that journal get published. So keeping in mind that if you send it to a new journal, taking in mind all the comments that came from the previous one you submitted, I think that would definitely help you get it published in another one.
Sharing at conferences, there was a question about, material that's presented at conferences and maybe turned into working papers and so on. Now, this really differs according to discipline. Quite often in the economics, agricultural economics, social sciences community, it's not a major problem. You can have a working paper version which gets converted into a journal version. And the editors don't have a problem with that, the publishers don't have a problem with that. But in nutrition journals and health sciences journals, quite often it's an impediment. So if it exists in some form, some very similar form before, then it is a problem. So it really depends upon the discipline that you're talking about. So it's not the same across. So you should really give some thought, depending on where you want to publish it. I know colleagues who will not, for example, if there's a conference proceedings coming out, give their permission for the paper to be included in conference proceeding, because it reduces the chances of getting it published later. So you have to decide your strategy before and then go on the basis of that.
I just want to make two comments. One was about what do you do with papers that are rejected. As everybody in the panel said, you have to attend to the comments that are made. I have had experience where the paper that was rejected by one journal was sent to us. It somehow passed the initial desk review and went to, because there would always be occasions when in some disciplines the number of referees available is very limited, And within 48 hours, we get a letter from the referee saying, these are my comments for the particular journal, and they've not even been addressed, so I don't see any point. So you get a quick rejection. And not only that, the editor turns against you and says, this is a person I wouldn't like to deal with in the future.
Oh.
And these things tend to remain. The other thing I want to add to what Bhavani Shankar said about how the introduction must immediately capture the editor to pass the desk review. What I have found very, very useful is that always write a letter to the editor separately. And the letter to the editor must summarize what you think is your paper, what is the importance and what is the relevance.
A covering letter, you
Yeah,
mean?
covering letter. And in this day of electronic communication, covering letters don't become important. But I think it's a very, very good medium by which you can convince the editor that this should pass the desk review. Because I've always found that your chances of getting a paper published, once it passes the initial review, is very, very much higher. You improve your chances almost 90%, because you will invariably get 2 or 3 reviewers looking at it, giving fairly, unless it's a very poor quality paper, it's quite different reviews, and you can always attend to them. And even if one of the reviews is negative, because the remaining 2 may be sitting on the fence, you have a very good chance of getting it. So passing through the initial desk review is very, very important. And you need to communicate your ideas very clearly in the paper.
Thank you. Yes, please do.
So that's really important, and I want to underscore it by making a couple of additional points. In my experience as an editor, I handled roughly, 2,500 papers over a 9-year period, which meant almost double that number of referee reports. And one of the statements that recur in referee reports that I see often is the specific criticism that either a paper has been submitted prematurely, in other words, the research hasn't been properly vetted among colleagues, and the improvements that are necessary haven't been made, right? Or that there's something about the paper that doesn't communicate clearly what the research question is, what it is that the paper is trying to accomplish. And I would say that those 2 points are probably the most frequent ones that I've seen in referee reports, that the paper's prematurely submitted to the journal. When you submit a paper to a journal, it should be considered the final product, not a work in progress. And oftentimes, there's more work to be done, sharing it with colleagues, getting friendly feedback from others who can help you strengthen that work before you send it to the journal. And if you've done the research properly, then the publication process should be much easier. And then the second is that oftentimes referees have difficulty finding the point of the paper. And it may seem like a very simple thing, but it shouldn't be a mystery. We should be reading mysteries in our spare time, but we should be writing nonfiction, and there shouldn't be anything mysterious about what you're trying to accomplish in your paper. So although we like to read mysteries, as non-academics, as academics, we don't like mysteries. So make sure that your paper very early is very clear about what the research question is and what the point of the paper is.
Thank you. May I request Professor Richard Strange to make some announcements, which I'm sure would gather more questions. So.
The point about the announcement is that there will be a report of this this meeting, the 2017 ANH Academy and Nutrition Innovation Labs and Symposium in Food Security, in Food Security, the journal, which I edit. And additionally, we hope to publish around about 4 papers that's negotiable from the current conference scientific sessions. And those will go as a special section of the journal. What is the Food Security Journal? There should be outside some flyers. Please take one. The journal's full title is Food Security, the Science, Sociology, and Economics of Food Production and Access to Food. It was actually, it may be of interest, that the initiation of the journal was inspired by Norman Borlaug, who actually came to a meeting of the International Society of Plant Pathologists. So I feel slightly a fish out of water here as a plant pathologist. Nevertheless, I've had a rather sharp learning curve over the last 9 years, of which I've been editor. So we decided we would have a task force for food security, and one of the products has been this journal. Now, what we are interested in is the fact that over half the world's population does not have a proper diet. There are about 2 billion who have overnutrition, 2 billion who have food micronutrient or vitamin deficiencies. It's better. Okay. Thank you. Oh yes, that's better. So we're interested in research which discovers this, and then we're interested in research that actually tries to overcome these problems. I took rather literally the business of getting published, and these are things which I think everybody should know. Probably most of you do, but nevertheless, it's possibly worth just saying a few things about it. Obviously, the title's got to represent the topic of the paper, and then the abstract should state very succinctly exactly what you've done, what are the real main points. Then the introduction, what is the state of play before you came along and did your wonderful experiments? We need to know that, and of course this must be well referenced. Now, materials and methods, these are extremely important, and they should give enough information so that anybody else can come along afterwards and repeat precisely your experiments. If they don't work, it may be they did something wrong, but with luck, they will confirm what you've done. Then the results, again, should be succinct. The results can be quite short, 2 or 3 tables, perhaps a histogram or something, but as I'll say in the bottom, the tables and figures, they should generally be completely intelligible on their own. So somebody can pick up a journal, look at a graph, and see exactly what that is representing without reference to the text. Then the discussion, you must show really how your work has dovetailed in with what's gone on before. So you show what your place has been in the subject. Then, of course, it references, you must follow the style of the journal. A point which came up in the discussion is a question of rejection and choice of journal. Springer, who's the publisher of Food Security, has a transfer desk, so-called. So, for example, if I get a paper which I think is quite well written and it's got something to say, but it's really not on the not aligned properly with food security, our brief, then I will say yes, pop it into the transfer desk, and then Springer will suggest to the author alternative journals. So that can be quite helpful. It might be of interest for you to know how the paper flows in food security. So the first thing that happens is that I get an alert by email from Springer, and I then usually follow down on the left-hand side, if it's any good at all. If the paper is obviously a desk reject, then of course I do it directly. So straight down to the bottom of the screen. Normally I point an SE as a senior editor. Because the scope of the journal is so wide, there are 4 senior editors. One looks after the more physical side of food security, So we talk about climate change, that sort of thing, and soil science. There's the biological side. My subject, plant pathology, comes into that, entomology and so on. Then we've got linked together, we have sociology and nutrition. And then finally we have economics and politics. So I've got 4 people who are senior editors on that. So, okay, following down the left-hand side, appoint a senior editor, then he either appoints an associate editor. I have about 45 on the editorial board, or he goes straight to appointing 2 reviewers. The reviewers then make their reviews, it goes back to the senior editor. The associate editor makes his decision on the basis of the reviews and anything else that he wants to say. And the senior editor makes the decision, and it finally comes back to me. On the right-hand side, there are various shortcuts. I might myself appoint a couple of reviewers, or I appoint an associate editor. But that's the way the papers go. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Richard. May I now request you to pose the questions you may have for Richard or our other panelists? We are almost coming towards the end of this session.
Usually, researchers, we always think of positive result highlighting more than the other non-positive result. So I feel that is also findings in the results. We always, as a learner, think of always positive result to highlight in the articles. As an editor, what is your opinion? And I would like to hear that. I feel that is also important findings if we have enough justification and enough analysis. I just want to hear that.
I have 2 questions. The first one is about impact factor. There is this confusion. We have to go always to the higher impact factor, but it's not as easy as it looks. So what's your view of that impact factor? And the other thing is novelty. Sometimes my papers were rejected because they were not novel. What does that mean? Thank you.
So basically we start with a research hypothesis and we have a strategy, we have a goal on which journal we have to publish, and we start the work, and it takes around 4 or 5 years depending upon the research you are looking at, maybe a conservation agriculture or a resource conservation technology like that. And by the time you get the result and you submit to that particular journal, the focus of the research that shifts by that time. Maybe it's more on climate smart agriculture, or you can sense from the editor's comments that they need certain kind of analysis to substantiate that result. But by that time, you don't have research funding to go further analysis or to have more year to spend on that. So I'd like to the panelist's suggestion what to do in that case.
I'll just respond to yours regarding the negative findings. I agree with you that, while doing research and as researchers, everything doesn't come positive. And as an editor, I would also take negative findings as very valuable. And it's not necessary that they would get rejected just because it didn't come out the way it was supposed to come out.
Actually, if you're doing a study which is a trial, you can register the study and so that even if the results are negative, there is a guarantee that it will be published. This is to ensure that not only trials with positive results are published in the literature. So you go through the process when you design the trial and you register the trial, and then you know automatically that even if the results are not positive, they would be published.
So I think it's very difficult to publish non-results or to publish negative results. And again, one has to look more deeply at the research to understand why there's lack of finding. Sometimes there may be insufficient power in the sample to provide the kind of statistical significance that you would want to see. And so it may be a more fundamental flaw with the research than an actual evidence of absence, right? So I think that if you have non-findings, and if those are sufficiently robust from a research point of view, then you have to find some way to wrap that non-finding within a story. And that story, that narrative, has to resonate with fellow researchers, and the non-finding has to make sense within the larger context of research that your work is embedded in. On the point of which journal to target, I would say the easiest rule of thumb is to look at your list of references. And if you're referencing papers from particular journals, then that probably suggests that you should target those journals. If you're sending your paper to a journal and you're not citing any references that have appeared in that journal, then that might be a signal to you that you're sending your paper to the wrong place. You should at least think of your research as communicating and engaging in a conversation with other researchers. And so if that conversation has been taking place in a particular journal, then that's a good place for your research. On the other hand, if that conversation hasn't been taking place in that journal, then you might find it more difficult to publish there.
Thank you, Jerry. Bhavani, we haven't heard from you for a while, so
Sure.
how about...
Yeah, so negative results, yes, I completely agree with Jerry. This is perhaps, I mean, in the social science world, we have relatively few trials, so it's a problem that's quite a common one. And I have to admit, it is difficult to publish negative results, non-results, and there is a bias towards publishing positive results, although negative results, as we all know, do tell you something, and they have a certain amount of information. And I completely agree, if you want to publish it in a journal, for example, in agricultural economics journals, then you would need a story. You would need to write, you need some clever writing so that the non-result or negative result is a reasonably logical and interesting conclusion that flows from that, rather than a standard description and then say, oh, it doesn't work, it's not significant, and whatever. I think to some extent, journals like the PLOS journals do address some of the problems with negative results, because that's, again, that's not, it's less of a criterion for publication there, and it's an editor's job to ensure that it doesn't become an important criterion, that the bias is minimized. Because this is quite subconscious often, when reviewers read it, they say, well, okay, so this is insignificant, so what's the point? And there may be a point, because it might be telling you that perhaps sometimes that the theory doesn't always hold true. Maybe the theory the received wisdom from the theory needs to be modified. Sometimes it does tell you useful things. So either you do some clever writing and recast it in the regular journals that you want to publish in, or you find journals which are more receptive, but it is a difficult business. That's something we have to acknowledge. Somebody asked about impact factors. Yes, highly imperfect metric, we all know that. We know that lots of journals will game the impact factor in various ways, and publishing houses do that too. So it's all a slightly murky business, but it is an important metric that's universally accepted. And so that's an imperfect world that we have to live in, where impact factors are used, especially across disciplines, which is really difficult and slightly nonsensical quite often, given that everything depends on the impact factors decided by the discipline that you're in, and it's all relative. But it's there, and it's something that we work. But there are other metrics coming up. Elsevier has started its own suite of metrics, which perhaps try to tweak things a little bit. So there's a series of things that are coming up. I think the world will change a little bit in the next 5 years about what the standard metric might be. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
How about the novelty? There was one question.
Yeah, yes.
Novelty of your findings, and how do you balance that in this world?
Yes, no, it's really difficult. Novelty, which is innovation, lack of innovation. So there are journals, as I pointed out, the PLOS journals do not look for novelty, they look for correctness. So their philosophy, it's a controversial philosophy, because they believe that if you've got a finding and it's robustly done, it's useful scientific information. It should not be denied its place in the world. So in other words, 10 years down the road, when somebody does a meta-analysis or a systematic review, they have another data point from which to draw on. So and then their view also is that you let the scientific communities then decide which individual articles are actually novel, innovative, and so on. It's the rigor that's important at the point of publishing. So that's a very particular view. Not large sections of the academic community don't agree with that. But the point is that there are journals which will much more. One thing is for sure, if the work is not well done, it's not rigorous, it's not going to get published in any decent journal. Lack of innovation, there are journals which will not target innovation specifically, you can find them. And always be open-minded that there are regional journals, for example, which might be, rather than international journals, which might be more receptive to country-specific information, which is not necessarily pushing the boundaries in terms of international science, but is quite important from a national perspective. So it's important to tailor the paper to the right kind of journal. So yes, innovation is important, novelty is important, but if you're realistic, you can find ways. If you've got a good, well-done paper, even if it's not terribly novel, you can find ways of publishing it in a relevant journal.
Thank you so much, panelists. What an interesting session. We come to the close of this session, and I'd just like to run through what came up, what popped up during the discussion. And the emphasis was on the scientific rigor of your writing and following the prescribed headings and being rigorous with your writing, rereading your work, making your friends read it, comment on it, and read it yourself, edit, always a difficult task. However, there's no shortcut to that. Identifying the appropriate journals, including a covering letter, which throws light on the importance of your work, and paying heed to the comments by the reviewers, not to make shortcuts, not to brush it aside, were some of the key things that that were discussed. I would like to wish all of you success in your scientific writing and publication, and let's hope that there'll be more and more papers from you in the coming symposia. So thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence here this morning.